Welcome back, everyone. We're about to take a deep dive into some pretty intense territory. We're going to be looking at perpetrators of mass violence.
Always a cheery topic, right?
Well, somebody's got to do it.
Right.
And lucky for us, we've got some incredible guides for this journey.
Yeah, we're looking at this article from Politics and Rights Review. It really gets into the nitty-gritty.
And the authors?
Antonius Robin and Alexander Laban-Hinton. They actually wrote a whole book on this, Perpetrators Encountering Humanity's Dark Side. Pretty intense, right?
Yeah, definitely not light reading. So for this deep dive, I think we should assume our listeners are already familiar with the basics. Academics, experts, people who are already grappling with these tough questions.
Agreed. So let's just jump right in, shall we? Robin and Hinton, they don't waste any time. They start the article with this stark statement, this reality check. Perpetrators are making a comeback.
A comeback, you mean?
On the world stage. I mean, look at what's happening in Ukraine, Sudan, Myanmar, the Middle East. Mass human rights violations are happening right now as we speak. It's like the surge in impunity.
It's chilling. It makes you wonder, are international justice efforts failing to keep pace? I mean, is that what they're suggesting?
Well, if we look at the numbers, it's hard to argue otherwise, right? Like the International Criminal Court, the ICC, they've only secured 11 convictions since 2002, which is, a pretty dismal record when you consider the scale of the atrocities we're talking about.
It's just mind-boggling. And it's not just the ICC.
Right, exactly. Look at the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia. 15 years, tons of resources, and they only managed 3 convictions.
Convictions.
For the Khmer Rouge's crimes. Think about that. 3 convictions for millions of deaths.
It's almost unbelievable.
And, even when there are convictions, you see this push for amnesty. Like what's happening now in Argentina, they convicted over 1,000 individuals for crimes during the dictatorship. And now, calls for pardons.
It's like we're going backward, which makes understanding these perpetrators, how they operate, what motivates them, it makes all of that even more urgent, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I mean, how do we address a problem we don't understand? And Robin and Hinton, they get into that, right? They define perpetrators in a way that's, it's broader than how we usually think about it.
It's broader. In what sense?
They're including not just the people directly committing the violence, but also the organizers, the architects.
The people behind the scenes, pulling the strings.
Exactly. The ones who make it all happen.
That's interesting, because it kind of dismantles this idea that there's a clean separation between those who give the orders and those who carry them out.
Right. It's all one system. And they also point out that this isn't limited to, state actors, governments.
So non-state actors as well.
Think about groups like Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram. They operate outside of those formal power structures, but they're still perpetrators, right?
Okay, so we're getting a clearer picture of who we're talking about. But there's this one thing in the article that I found really fascinating and maybe a little unsettling. They talk about empathy.
Empathy for perpetrators.
And it almost feels counterintuitive, right?
It's definitely a sensitive area. But it's important to understand what they mean by empathy because they make a clear distinction between sympathy and empathy.
So not about feeling sorry for them.
Right, exactly. No sympathy. They're talking about 2 specific types, cognitive empathy and affective empathy.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me.
Cognitive empathy, it's about trying to map the perpetrator's worldview, understand their beliefs, their ideology, even their justifications, however twisted they might be.
So trying to see the world through their eyes.
Yeah, like stepping into their minds, basically. Trying to grasp their logic, even if that logic is ultimately flawed, even if it leads to horrific acts.
And how do you actually do that as a researcher?
Well, they suggest looking at things like public statements, decrees, policies, and comparing those with testimonies from victims and survivors to try to piece together that internal logic.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about effective empathy? That seems even harder to grasp.
Right. Effective empathy is about trying to understand emotionally what the perpetrator is experiencing. Like, how do torturers, executioners, guards, how do they actually feel when they're committing these acts?
I mean, can we even begin to comprehend that?
It's a tough question, and it's something we'll definitely need to unpack further, but I think it's crucial to understanding the psychology of these individuals.
So we've got this concept of empathy, but how do you even begin to research perpetrators in a practical sense.
Yeah.
Especially if they've been directly involved in violence. I mean, are they just going to confess their crimes?
Well, that's the challenge, right? It's one of the most difficult aspects of this field. Interviews, for example, they're riddled with difficulties.
I can only imagine. You're dealing with people who are likely to downplay their role, to justify their actions, maybe even deny everything.
Exactly. And there's this huge fear of self-incrimination. I mean, who's going to willingly confess to crimes that could land them in prison for life? So you have to be strategic.
Strategic.
Robin and Hinton, they talk about the importance of patience, of building trust. They spent years in Cambodia and Argentina really immersing themselves in those environments, cultivating relationships.
So it's a long game, not something you can just parachute in and achieve overnight.
Right. It takes time. And even then, there are no guarantees. They often had to rely on indirect questioning, focusing on broader themes instead of directly asking about specific acts.
Like what? Give me an example.
Instead of saying, "Did you kill this person?" you might ask about their experiences during the conflict or their reasons for joining a certain group.
So it's about kind of circling around the issue,
Mm-hmm.
trying to glean information without directly confronting them.
It's a delicate dance, for sure. You're always aware of the potential for manipulation.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, these are individuals who are masters of deception.
Robin and Hinton are very open about that. They know perpetrators might try to control the narrative, to downplay their role, to justify their actions. So you have to be constantly vigilant.
So how do you sort through all of that? How do you separate truth from fabrication? It seems like trying to piece together a puzzle where some of the pieces are deliberately misleading.
And that's where critical analysis comes in. You have to compare their accounts with other sources, victim testimonies, official documents, historical records, anything you can find to corroborate or contradict what they're saying.
It sounds exhausting, like emotionally and intellectually.
And that brings us to another crucial aspect of this research, the personal toll it takes on the researchers themselves. Robin and Hinton, they're incredibly candid about that, about the emotional weight of encountering these perpetrators, of delving into the darkest aspects of human nature.
They talk about nightmares, anxieties, the lingering effects of these encounters.
It's heavy stuff. It makes you realize this isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's deeply personal and emotionally challenging.
And they even use their own emotional responses as data, as a way to understand the power dynamics at play in the research itself.
Which is a whole other layer of complexity. It highlights the unique challenges of this kind of work. You need this balance of empathy, critical thinking, emotional resilience, and you're constantly navigating ethical minefields.
I can see why they call it encountering humanity's dark side. I think that's a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much more to explore.
Oh, yeah, we're just getting started. So we talked about, interviewing perpetrators, the emotional toll, the constant analysis. But how do you even begin to write about this stuff? Like, how do Robin and Hinton suggest we go about capturing all of this complexity?
Yeah, it seems like just sticking to, traditional academic writing, that kind of dry, objective style, it wouldn't really capture the nuances, would it?
They actually argue against that. They say a single writing style just isn't enough. It flattens the narrative, you lose all those layers of complexity we're trying to understand.
So what do they suggest instead? Like, how do you write about this stuff effectively?
They propose a more flexible approach, using different writing styles, basically, to illuminate different aspects of the perpetrator's world.
So not just sticking to the typical academic style.
Right. I mean, they don't completely dismiss expository arguments. Those are important for laying the groundwork, presenting the facts, the analysis. But they also talk about the power of polyphonic narratives.
Polyphonic, meaning?
Multiple voices, multiple perspectives. Bringing in the voices of victims, witnesses, even the perpetrators themselves, letting those voices kind of weave together and create a more textured understanding.
So it's about creating a more holistic picture.
Exactly. And they're not afraid to get creative either. They suggest exploring creative nonfiction, ethnographic poetry, even graphic novels.
Graphic novels.
Yeah.
To talk about perpetrators.
It might seem unconventional, but think about it. It's a way to engage readers on a deeper level, a more visceral level, like Art Spiegelman's Maoist. Remember that one? About the Holocaust?
Yeah, powerful book.
He used animals, right? To depict the horrors of the Holocaust. It's a perfect example of how a non-traditional form can be incredibly impactful.
Absolutely. It's about finding the right tool for the job, I guess.
Right. Matching the form to the content. And they also talk about using images. Photographs, especially.
Yeah, a single photograph can sometimes convey more than pages of text. like that visceral impact you were talking about.
Exactly. But they also caution against the potential for images to, distort our understanding. Photos can be taken out of context, manipulated.
It's like anything else, right? You have to be critical. Think about the source, the agenda.
Always. Always be questioning. And that circles back to self-awareness, right? Whether you're interviewing, analyzing documents, writing, you have to be aware of your own biases, your own assumptions.
It's a lot to juggle.
Yeah.
It's almost like being a detective, a therapist, and a writer all rolled into one.
It's definitely not easy work. And Robin and Hinton are upfront about that, about the toll it takes on you personally. Like, they describe how encountering these individuals, it can stay with you, even infiltrate your dreams.
Yeah, it makes you wonder who is drawn to this kind of work. Like, what kind of person can handle that level of, I don't know, darkness?
It's a good question. Maybe it's a combination of empathy and like this deep need to understand the darkest parts of human nature.
To scare into the abyss.
Maybe, but not to condone it. To try to make sense of it, to figure out how to prevent it from happening again.
That's a powerful motivator. But it's also risky, right? I mean, even with the best intentions, even with the most rigorous methods, there's always a chance you could cause harm or unintentionally give a platform to dangerous ideologies.
You're right. And that's why they emphasize ethical considerations. Like, at every step of the process, constantly asking yourself, what are the potential risks? How can I mitigate those risks? Am I really equipped to handle all of this?
Those are tough questions, and I imagine there are no easy answers.
Definitely not. But I think the first step is just acknowledging those questions, recognizing the responsibility that comes with doing this kind of work. Like, this isn't a game. It's real people, real lives.
And it's not just about understanding the perpetrators. It's about understanding ourselves. Like, what are we capable of as human beings?
And maybe through that understanding, we can find a way to create a more just and compassionate world, a world where these horrors don't happen anymore. It's a tall order, but I think it's worth striving for.
Absolutely. This has been a really thought-provoking conversation. We've talked about the challenges of interviewing perpetrators, the complexities of representing their stories, the ethical considerations, and I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
We have. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to consider the bigger picture. Like, what does all of this tell us about humanity, about the potential for both good and evil that exists within each of us? And what can we do with this knowledge to create a more just and peaceful world?
We've been talking about this really heavy stuff, this perpetrator research. And you've mentioned the emotional toll, the ethical dilemmas. It seems like there's this tension between trying to understand these individuals and the potential harm that can come from, even engaging with their perspective. So how do we deal with that?
Well, Robin and Hinton, they offer this really interesting metaphor in their article. They call it the Medusa effect.
The Medusa effect, like the mythical creature.
Yeah, exactly. The one who could turn anyone who looked at her to stone. They're basically saying that encountering perpetrators, even indirectly through research, it can be like that. Like staring into Medusa's face.
Okay, I'm following. So you're saying it can be kind of petrifying.
Yeah, like deeply unsettling. It can make you question everything, your beliefs about good and evil, even your own humanity. And, it can lead to some really negative consequences in the real world, too.
Negative consequences? Like what?
Well, you might face disapproval from colleagues. Like, they think you're getting too close to the darkness,
Yeah.
Or you might even feel a sense of being contaminated by association.
Wow, that's intense. It made sense, though. I mean, it's heavy stuff. How do you protect yourself from that?
That's the thing. Robin and Hinton, they don't shy away from the difficulty. They actually argue that this struggle, this discomfort, it can actually make the research more insightful.
How so?
Because it forces you to find new ways of approaching the subject. You can't just rely on the same old methods, the same old language. You have to be more creative, more indirect.
It's almost like the discomfort is pushing you to think outside the box.
Exactly. It's like, okay, how do I describe this? How do I analyze this without getting sucked into the abyss myself? It pushes you to find new ways of thinking, new ways of writing.
That's fascinating. So it's not about ignoring the discomfort, but about using it.
Exactly. It's like acknowledge it, learn from it, and use it to fuel your research. And ultimately, I think it comes down to this. How can we use this knowledge to prevent future atrocities?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
If we can understand what makes a perpetrator, what leads them down that path, then maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to intervene to stop it before it starts.
It's a hopeful thought, at least. But it also makes me wonder, who's equipped to do this kind of research? I mean, it takes a special kind of person, right?
Yeah.
To handle all of this darkness, all of this complexity.
And that's where those guidelines come in, the ones Robin and Hinton lay out for researchers who are, brave enough to venture into this territory.
Right, they mentioned 3. What were they again?
First is self-awareness, which we've already talked about, right? You got to be aware of your own biases, your own baggage. It's especially important in this field where the stakes are so high.
Makes sense. And the second one?
Writing flexibility. We touched on that earlier, right? Like using different styles to represent different aspects of the perpetrator's world.
Right. Not just sticking to the traditional academic style.
They encourage researchers to experiment, to play around with different forms, expository arguments, polyphonic narratives, creative nonfiction, even like ethnographic poetry or graphic novel.
It's about finding the right tool for the job.
Exactly. And the third guideline, it's kind of related to writing, but it's about the use of images, photographs in particular.
Images can be so powerful.
They can be. But they can also be misleading, right? So you got to be careful. Think about the context, the potential for manipulation. It all ties back to that critical thinking we were talking about.
So basically, you need to be a super sleuth, a therapist, a philosopher, and a writer, all at the same time.
Pretty much.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up. This has been an incredible deep dive. A huge thank you to you, to Antonius Robin and Alexander Laban Hinton for their work. And to our listeners, if you're intrigued by all of this, definitely check out their book, Perpetrators, Encountering Humanity's Dark Side. It's a challenging read, but it's so worth it. It really makes you think. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.